Okay, so now we're going to take a look at AO3 for the Romanian orphan research. So we're going to be jumping around a little bit. This isn't going to be in the same order as your slides, and we're going to be starting off with confounding variables. So please just make sure as you're following along that you're jumping to the correct slides so that you can take your annotations as well. Okay, so in terms of one of the major limitations of Romanian orphan studies are that there are considerable confounding variables, which make it hard for us to form any conclusions about institutionalisation. When we think about the precise conditions that the Romanian orphans were raised in, these were very, very unique. So often they were raised in institutions where there wasn't any electricity, where they were left to be in their cots for the majority of the day. They weren't provided with sufficient medicine. Sometimes they were over-medicated because they had been misdiagnosed as having intellectual disorders, which they didn't have. So the conditions in these orphanages are very, very different to the conditions in other orphanages like hospitals or orphanages in the UK. So the harmful effects that we might see in the Romanian orphan studies, in Rutter's ERA study, might actually represent the effects of poor institutionalisation rather than institutionalisation per se. So it might be difficult for us to generalise these findings to other institutionalisation settings. Now, the Romanian orphan studies were an improvement on previous studies, and in some respects they actually had fewer confounding variables. So if we think about who these Romanian orphans were, well, these were children who had parents who just couldn't afford to keep them in most cases. So previous studies looking at orphanages had focused on orphanages in the UK where the children had suffered trauma from losing their parents in the war, for example. And so these children had already suffered from early childhood trauma, which would have caused some intellectual disorders, which could have caused some attachment issues later in life. So in those earlier studies, it's really difficult to disentangle the effects of early childhood trauma from institutionalisation. So the Romanian orphan studies actually improve on these previous studies by having fewer confounding variables because a lot of those children didn't suffer from trauma. However, now this is probably the major point to consider when we're looking at the effects of institutionalisation that we've learned from Romanian orphan studies. The infants in Rutter's study were not randomly assigned to groups. It was not a lab experiment where the researcher puts everybody's names in a hat and everybody has an equal chance of being in the control or experimental groups. It wasn't that Rutter put all of the children's names in a hat and the first 50 or so names that were pulled out were adopted before 6 months, and the next names that were pulled out were adopted between 6 months and 2 years. It wasn't random like that. It wasn't a lab experiment. Could it be that the children who were adopted earlier, so those children who were adopted before 6 months, were more sociable? Could this have been why they were adopted earlier and why the parents chose them? Because remember, it was the parents that established these groups. It was the parents who chose which children to adopt. So they're the ones who are deciding who gets adopted before 6 months, between 6 months and 2 years, and 2 years to 4 years. So we have to consider, what led the parents to picking some children rather than others? Why were some children left for, another 2 years after, whereas some children were adopted straight away? Could it be that they had a better temperament? They were more sociable? Perhaps they were more smiley? Perhaps they were demonstrating more social releases? There was something that attracted the parents to these children that made them be chosen before the other kids and therefore meant that they were adopted earlier than the other children. Could it be that these same characteristics meant that while they were in the orphanages, they were receiving different treatment? So there are only a number of caregivers there. There are only a small number of workers working in these orphanages. They would also have been attracted to these particular children as well. The children with the better temperament, the children who were smiling more and seemed to be more sociable. The characteristics that led them to be adopted by the parents were the same characteristics that probably led to their better care while they were in the institution, which might have protected them against the effects of institutionalisation. if these children were picked up, if they were given cuddles, if they were held for a little bit longer while they were being fed, if they were played with more, and if they were provided with more opportunities for interactions, then these children were likely to have been able to form some sort of attachment to the caregivers while they're in the orphanage, which means then that they were unlikely to suffer such severe consequences of institutionalisation. And in this case then, it's actually not about institutionalisation at all. What it seems is that there are certain characteristics like temperament and sociability that determine the risks of institutionalisation. So this creates for us a confounding variable, and it means that now this becomes actually a quasi-study rather than a natural study. Remember, a quasi-study is a study where the IV is determined by the characteristics of our participants. So in this case, that temperament and sociability is determining the age of adoption. And so the fact that this means that there's a quasi-study means that there are participant variables which are affecting the findings. It means that we can't really be certain about the effects of institutionalisation, because it could be that different children are affected by institutionalisation differently depending on their temperament. And so this is a major limitation of this Romanian orphan research, is the fact that there was no random allocation of participants to the different groups. So this is where we're going to jump around a bit, because I now want to introduce you to one of the strengths, which is research support here by Xenia, and this is the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. So let's just jump now to this slide. So Rutter wasn't the only person to conduct research into Romanian orphans. There's also been an ongoing study called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. And this is a more controlled study. So this study helped to overcome some of the confounding variables of the ERA. So I just want to skip forward to have a look at this study in a little bit more detail. So in this research, there were 136 children who were 12 to 31 months old, who had spent most of their lives in institutionalised care. So on average, the children had spent 90% of their lives in some sort of orphanage or institution. And in this study, the children were randomly assigned to either a foster care group or an institutionalised care group. So in the foster care group, they were then put temporarily with families, and in institutionalised care, they remained in orphanages. They had then a control group of 72 non-institutionalised children. And these children were all assessed on attachment type, so attached according to the strange situation. They were also assessed and observed for disinhibited attachment, and also assessed on their IQ and intellectual functioning. And they're currently assessing these children at age 16. So let's have a look at the findings here. So in the control group, 74% of children were securely attached. So remember, these were the non-institutionalised children. And here we see quite similar rates, actually quite high rates of type B attachment, according to the strange situation. Not surprising, because these children were raised in non-institutionalised settings. When we look at the institutionalised group, we see that 19% were securely attached. That's a very, very low number. If we consider that somewhere around 65% excuse me, is normal, then 19% is really low rates of secure attachment here. 44% showed signs of disinhibited attachment. This is that overfamiliarity with strangers and attention-seeking behaviour. And when we compare the institutionalised group to the control group and the foster care group, we can see that they've got lower IQ. And so here we can see the institutionalised group, the foster care group, and the control group here. So at 30 months, this is the IQ differences, and these continue at 42 and 54 months. And so here we can see drastic differences in IQ between those who were randomly assigned to institutionalised care or foster care. So why is this so important? Well, first of all, it provides us with further supportive evidence for the effects of institutionalisation. So we don't have to just rely on the flawed Rutter's ERA study. Here we've got additional research support. And this in some ways is actually better because it was more controlled. So like the Romanian orphans, there was no significant trauma or bereavement that led to institutionalisation. And in this case, there was random allocation of children to the conditions. This wasn't decided by the parents, this was decided by the researchers. And so this helps to minimise participant variables. Now it doesn't depend on the sociability or the temperament of the child, it was completely random. And we still see the effects of institutionalisation appear. So this has got greater internal validity than the ERA study and overcomes some of the major limitations of the ERA study and still supports the effects of institutionalisation. We still see disinhibited attachment, we still see low IQ. Okay, so just going back to the original slide. So we've looked at confounding variables, and then we've looked at how this has been overcome with other research support, which overcomes the confounding variables of Rutter's study and finds similar effects of institutionalisation. So let's have a look now at this point here about attrition. Now, those of you who'd studied geography will have heard this word before. I don't know exactly what it means in geography, but it's something to do with like the wearing down of rocks and erosion. And we see similar things happen in longitudinal studies. So this study had to be longitudinal because we wanted to see the long-term effects of institutionalisation. So it wouldn't have been clever to just study them at one point in time. We want to follow these Romanian orphans to see what they're like developmentally at ages 11 and 16 and now that they're in their 20s and 30s. But longitudinal studies always carry the risk of participants dropping out. This dropping out is called attrition. And normally this isn't a problem unless we start seeing some pattern in terms of who is continuing on with the study and who is dropping out. Typically, what we're likely to see in a study like this is that the children who are likely to drop out are the ones who are going to be experiencing the greatest difficulties. So those that have had difficulties forming relationships with their parents and difficulties at school, and those children who suffer from the lowest IQ are the ones who are unlikely to be participating after 20 years because perhaps they've lost contact with their families or perhaps they've had other adverse life events. And so it's likely to then lead us to have a biased sample. So we're not likely to get a full picture of the effects of institutionalisation because we haven't been able to study the entire sample of Romanian orphans. So this could be a problem because it could mean that our results there are unfair and unrepresentative. However, I guess to argue against this, when they studied them at age 15, 90% of the Romanian orphans were still taking part in the study. I'm not sure what the latest figures are on that, but still, most of the children are still taking part. So that means that we're perhaps less likely to see any bias in the findings. And finally, one of the major strengths of all of this research is just how much understanding it has provided us in terms of early childhood neglect and the importance of emotional support on childhood development. So there's been huge utility, really important utility of the findings of Romanian orphan research. So it's helped improve psychologists' understanding of the effects of institutionalisation, the importance of emotional care, etc. And has led to major improvements in childcare in institutions. And so nowadays, rather than having a large number of caregivers for each child, we typically just have one or two key workers for each child so that they are able to form an attachment with one key person rather than having lots of people coming and going and not being able to form that attachment. And this gives children a much greater chance to develop a normal attachment, which is going to help prevent any long-term effects of institutionalisation. We also see an increase in foster care rather than orphanages. Because as much as possible, we want to give children the chance to be able to form attachments. Even if later they're broken, they're still going to be able to have some continuity of care when they form attachments to their new adoptive families. But it's just really important to provide that emotional care at a very early age. If you're interested in this research, there's lots of papers online, and this research is being conducted by UCL. And so I would recommend that you get reading, and I'm happy to share the original studies with you. It is very, very interesting reading.